So like Chris said, today we're going to talk about the well-being of young women in the northeastern region of Uganda, where I spent about a year and a half following a group of 16 girls through their final year of upper secondary school. And just to give you a little context, here we are in Uganda. We're looking at the northeastern corner, which is bordered by South Sudan and Kenya. The Karamoja people are quite a minority in Uganda, being a semi-nomadic community and an agropastoralist lifestyle, who are more akin to some of their neighboring communities in Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Sudan, whereas the vast majority of Uganda is set up into more of a sedentary kingdom communities traditionally, and that at some point will be relevant in our talk. Karamoja historically has been a pretty difficult place to live. They do have a very arid climate. Water is a real problem. And there's also been a lot of political marginalization and isolation throughout the years. I particularly like this map of the southern part of Karamoja, which is where the vast majority of Karamoja people live, because it really shows how the colonial and post-colonial government has really isolated them off from the rest of Uganda. In recent years, around 2010 or 11, relative peace has come to the region, but they also had violent cattle raiding and different problems in the past. So if we look at Karamoja, we know a couple of things here. If we look at it from a statistical point of view, we know that there's massive amounts of absolute poverty. You have 82% in absolute poverty. The acute food insecurity is very high, and actually the 2018 statistics are even worse, and right now they're bordering on food insecurity to famine this year, and that's based generally on a 3-year rain cycle that the region experiences. You also see the highest gender-based violence statistics in the nation in that region. So if we look at it from this perspective, we can see that there's a lot of marginalization going on. Now, if we look at education rates, there are no typos on this chart, except for one that I will tell you about, which is if we compare Karamoja to the Kampala, the center of Uganda, and I've also compared it to the northern region, where you might be familiar with the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony, where there was a lot of political instability in the recent history. You'll see that Karamoja has very low educational completion rates. So you're looking at 6% of children, of girls are finishing primary school. You've got 1% completing lower secondary school, which would be like the O level. And then the upper secondary school, this is the typo because it's really the statistics that we have available. It's actually lower than 1%. So if we look at Karamoja from this perspective, what we see is extreme marginalization. And what we can maybe assume by looking at this kind of data and other data like it within the region, we can say, well, let's improve the educational numbers, get more kids in school. We have other research that says once particularly girls are in school, they're less likely to have early or forced marriage, they're less likely to have babies early, they're more likely to have smaller families, and we can go from there and maybe assume empowerment. And so if we take a case study here, this is Tamara. She is a student who is right now in senior 6. And if we consider the previous statistics and we look at her, we could make some pretty optimistic assumptions about her. She's completed lower secondary school, so she is in that 1%. She has found a sponsor to take her to upper secondary school, and this November/December, she will be completing upper secondary school. So we can think, all right, Tamara's on her way. There are good things happening for her. She's likely to become more economically empowered than her counterparts in the village who do not have access to formal education. And so we think, great, we're doing a good job. But then we can look at other single measurements, like the Ibrahim and Anina study that's coming out, that's done in collaboration between University of Cambridge and Makerere University in Kampala, they're actually seeing that if you're looking at gender-based violence, there's really no difference between economically dependent and independent women. We also see that there's no difference in emotional, psycho, and social well-being between women who've been to school, have access to paid employment, and those who have not. And we can also see that actually, most disturbing, is that economically independent women are more likely to be vulnerable to sexual violence, primarily at the hands of their partners and spouses. And so if we look at this, and we see Ibrahim and Anina's conclusions that essentially economic empowerment does not help alleviate gender-based violence, now we have all of these different single metrics that are giving us contradictory information. And so now what do we do? Because now we've got some information that sort of negates a lot of the other information that we looked at before. And so what I'd like to do is perhaps propose a way in which we can try to better understand marginalization. Because all we know at this point is that the women are marginalized. But what exactly does that mean? And so what I'm proposing here is that we look at marginality. And there's a big quote, and I'll get to the whole thing. But we look at marginality as being defined by the social and economic events in somebody's life. That he doesn't say social or a social or an economic event, but Mudimbe talks about this sort of grouping of all of these different events that are defining the marginality. And so looking at it from this perspective, single metrics of well-being, and when we talk about, particularly in development studies and international development, a capability perspective, something that Amartya Sen developed, it's really not really getting to the heart of what it is that we're trying to learn about these girls. And so like Mudimbe, what I am proposing in my research is that we stop looking at girls, and particularly human beings, as being on a linear evolutionary spectrum as we categorize underdeveloped, developing, and developed countries, and how we define different groups of people in those terms. We're defining countries in those terms as well, and implicit or sometimes explicitly the people themselves. And so what I am doing in this study is rejecting that narrative that people are going to somehow evolve in their quote-unquote development. And so rather than looking at a spectrum where we're looking for progression, we're really talking about what is the intermediate space that people are living in. And again, this is from Mudimbe's Invention of Africa, 1988. And so what Mudimbe really says is that what is going on for the human being is that they're in this metaphorical space, and in that space, they have all of these questions for themselves. Questions like, what do I want to become? Students in my study are grappling with questions about how do I make use of this education when the vast majority of my family members have never been to school? What do I owe my community? What do I owe myself? And we look at students as having these questions and then being bombarded by regimes of truth that I use from a Foucauldian perspective, and the different discourses that influence what it is that they aspire to be. And so you have anything from cultural stereotypes. For example, when I go to Kampala, I will have legitimate questions from people who ask me, is it true that those Karamojangs still have tails? Are they wearing clothes yet? So even within the country community, you have major stereotypes and discourses that are affecting what and how people decide they want to live their lives. And so following this, then we have the person in the middle, and then we are asking ourselves, rather than how do we develop them on a spectrum, but how do we ask a person to reach their full potential? And so what I'm doing is working on that with Nussbaum's version of the capability approach, which rather than a perspective like Amartya Sen has proposed that's primarily used in development economics, this is more of a holistic narrative to ask not about the ends through people as means, but using each individual person as the end in themselves. And so I am really taking this perspective because when you have a situation where, when we look at Tamara, we can make some really positive assumptions about her. If there is still injustice going on in her situation, we cannot be complacent that our statistics look nicer and they look more presentable to an academic audience. And so the question that we're really asking is, if we were to use a single measurement of well-being for Tamara, like any of the ones that you'll see in a lot of international development and a lot of educational research, what you can ask is, are we misjudging her? And are we misjudging her situation? So using that theoretical perspective that I've spoken just now about, what I'm doing in my research is using the 10 capabilities that Martha Nussbaum would say are the basis of any individual in any culture being able to live a flourishing existence and a dignified life. And so what's nice about the Nussbaum approach to capabilities is that it can be culturally situated and it asks about the individual. So for example, if we look at bodily integrity is, if I'm looking at, I'm thirsty in the middle of the night and I need to go get water, I'm not worried about my safety. I'm in my house, I walk down the steps, I get some water, I go back to bed. It's no problem. I have to go to the restroom, not a problem. There's no scariness in that for me. But if you look at bodily integrity in the Karamoja context, this is defining how they live their lives. When do you walk 3 kilometers to the borehole? Is it safe for you to go by yourself? If you need water, but the other people in your village don't, are you going to risk it and go by yourself? These are all very serious questions that girls have to answer in that context. I'm going to skip that slide because that's okay. And so what we're going to do with Tamara is now just ask, how does she reach her potential? And in my research, my chapters are really divided by different categories of transition. So we're not assuming you finished high school and now you're an adult, that there's different aspects of your lives in which you transition into adulthood. And then we culturally situate that from the perspective of the Karamoja people. And so if we look at Tamara and we use the capability approach, then we're asking, what kind of resources does she have that's affecting all of those questions inside of the circle? What access or networks does she have that's either enabling her or inhibiting her from developing those things? Then that creates a choice for her. And then from there, we will see how is she functioning and has she had the ability to achieve well-being. And so if we look at Tamara, then we can say that she values her education. She takes advantage of a lot of leadership opportunities within her secondary school and hopes to pursue tertiary studies to, quote unquote, help Karamoja develop. We know that about her because she's been able to attend school when her father was still in his life. He was selling the family livestock to enable her to afford school fees. When her father left and there were also no other livestock to sell, she began working with the sisters who run her school. This is a Catholic missionary school, to try to make a little money. That little money she brings home, she starts brewing local alcohol, which is not only potentially dangerous for her as a young woman to be selling alcohol, but she's doing that in a climate where there's high rates of alcoholism in the region. We also know that she does get very good grades, and that gives her confidence to continue her studies. She sees the work of her mother and her mother's inability to take care of her and to pay her school fees, and gets inspiration from the alumni. She's horribly afraid of being wasted, like most of the girls in my study are, wasted in that there's been all of this investment in their education, but then they may not be able to reach the expectations that their family have for them by providing financial support. And we also know, though, if she does return to her village, she'll be less food insecure than her counterparts after secondary school because she happens to live in the most fertile region, part of the region. So then we ask, what choice does she have? Well, the choice is actually really limited. You know, if we looked at those single metrics, oh wow, she's the 1%, that's great. But at the end of the day, Tamara is very dependent on the benevolence of private donors who are supporting her education. To make that slightly more complicated, she doesn't know who the donors are. And the reason why she doesn't know who the donors are is that generally the religious sisters who are running the school do not want the donors to be in contact with the children, partly because you predominantly have, in this setting, the sisters getting financial support from predominantly white people in the United States, and they don't want there to be any more reinforcement of inferiority of these young women, and they also don't want them to feel as if they owe something to them. So do the donors have any idea if she's going to need help for tertiary education? Probably not. And so if we look at her functioning, yes, she is attending school, but she's not eligible for any further tertiary education. She will not have any qualifications to gain paid employment in the formal employment sector. She is dependent on finding yet another donor or trying to talk the sisters into figuring out how to pay for tertiary school. So the truth is, she really doesn't have a choice at this point. She doesn't view herself as a victim if we look at her well-being and how she actually feels about herself, but as somebody in a difficult situation. Now, on some hands, you might think that's a very optimistic thing and, you know, sort of good for her. But on the other end of the spectrum, what you see so many times is that students are internalizing the social and the economic events of their lives. They're internalizing those things as their own fault. They're internalizing the marginalization that comes from outside regimes into their own lives. And so what we know about her is that potentially she's going to become extraordinarily disappointed. She's probably going to go back to village life, and she will feel wasted and have low self-esteem because of that. So what we can say really is that her future is precarious if we start taking a multidimensional look at her well-being. We do have situations where even if you look at poorly resourced schools, they do provide opportunities for students. Tamara is in the video, and I'll point her out if we can see her. I think the sun is bit. But this is the charismatic Catholic group at the missionary school. And even amongst themselves, they will try to collect little monies here and there. Some of the girls, if they come for term with a bar of soap this big, they'll cut it in half at the beginning and try to only use half of it, so then they can go out into some of the villages and help some of the more vulnerable people. So I do want to just give you a little view of what that looks like, some of the capability development that the school is trying to do. Those are some of the vulnerable elderly people within the village that they've in some ways adopted in order to help support them. And you'd see the boxes where they are bringing different supplies for those people. Another thing to note, just in terms of if you're thinking about capability development, is that also there are other student groups within the school. It is a Catholic school, but you have a Muslim student association, you have a Protestant student association, there's a mini mosque on campus. School is organized so that Friday prayers can be attended by students without missing out on their education. And actually some of the food in those boxes was also donated by the Muslim student group. And so this is just sort of an example of one thing that you might see. And it's unfortunate, it's hard to see some of the villagers, but when you compare these girls to other girls of their age, they are noticeably bigger and taller than their counterparts who are not in school because they do have access to food every day. Oop. Now I'm going to give you one other case study. This is Anita, and this is Anita with her mother at their home. And what's really important to Anita is what she says here. I prefer town like Moroto in terms of where she wants to live in the future because I don't want to be the same. Now again, if I study and I live here in the village, even these neighbors will not even respect me because they will say, you're learnt, and you are living with us. What is the difference between you and us? At least if I go and I come and visit them, they're still happy. So part of her aspiration is to move out of the village to prove that her education has been useful. And the other bit of that is that she wants to go into accounting. So instead of a single measurement of a girl who finished upper secondary school that we might think from a statistical single metric point of view is doing really well, let's look at Anita. Anita, she values her education and she wants to become an accountant, like one of the sisters who does the finance at school. What we know about Anita is that she has studied maths in upper secondary school to pursue accounting, but on her national exams, she did not qualify for university level, but for a lower level of tertiary education. And she's on a foreign aid bursary scheme that guarantees her the ability, in terms of the contractual obligations that they have to the students, to allow her to study what it is that she chooses. Now, if we look at what other conversion factors are there for her, she feels honored to be the only one of 19 siblings between 6 different co-wives who is in school and will be hopefully supporting her family. She takes that very seriously. She's afraid of floating, as in not being able to find employment. And if for some reason she's not able to pursue tertiary education, get a qualification, and find paid employment, she's likely going to be very food insecure because she lives in one of the driest areas of Karamoja. So we ask, what choice does she have? And what we actually see is that she really doesn't have a choice. It's a false choice. And what I mean by that is that the foreign aid bursary scheme that is promising her autonomy and choosing her future has negated their obligations to her, which they do in very many situations, which means they're telling her, you're going to be a teacher. You're going to primary school teacher training, which is actually the one thing she didn't want to do. And by going to primary teacher training, if she continues and finishes this training, she will get paid less than secondary teachers. She will not have enough money to move out of the village. She won't be able to have a permanent house. And she's likely to still live with food insecurity because of the low pay of those teachers. And so again, if we look at her functionings, she could attend the primary school college. When I saw her last April before I came home at the end of April 2018, she was not leaving her huts on her family compound in protest because she did not want to go to teacher training. And even to get water, even to bathe, her sisters who are not in school have supported her in the protest and told her they will go to get the water. She bathes inside of her own home. And, you know, although throughout her history, her mother has been very supportive of her doing whatever it is that she wants, when it comes down to it, now mom is saying, follow dad. Dad says go to teacher training. The foreign aid bursary scheme says go to teacher training. But when I talked to Anita in April, as well as in previous phone conversations, what she reports is feelings of helplessness, hopelessness. She talks about how depressed she is. Many students talk about wanting to commit suicide because they're not able to pursue the dreams that they thought they were able to pursue when they were in secondary school. And again, we see an internalization of failure, that she's justifying that this was her decision to go to teacher training because she had to physically sign the papers, even though that was not actually her decision. It was the decision of the NGO who's sponsoring her work. And so, because she doesn't have the ability to advocate for herself and try to take it to the next level, her future remains bleak, and she will likely remain on needing assistance through foreign aid food schemes and different things of that nature, because there is no other economy, if she stays in her region, to make use of her skills. I'm going to skip that because we're sort of getting to Q&A. But essentially, those are 2 case studies to show. The purpose is not to try to show you a depressing picture, but to show you a nuanced picture of what is actually going on in people's lives. I am in this research study questioning the basic theoretical construct of what international development is and how so much of the research is constructed and how it perceives people, particularly people who are quote unquote other from many of the Western institutions that do promote their international development research. I'm also looking at trying to ensure that, particularly given the historic mis- and underrepresentation of women, particularly women of color, particularly sub-Saharan African women, that we are not trying to judge people based on what our own standards of adulthood, of our own standards of what womanhood means to the individual, but do this study in a way that respects and honors what adulthood means to these women in their own context. I'm also questioning not just how we perceive international development, but then also the measurement that goes into that discussion, and promoting Nussbaumian, a more complex view of well-being and quote-unquote development. And also talk about what does it mean to be an educated person, and how relevant is the education that these girls are receiving in formal education, how relevant is that to their lives? How relevant is it if you are coming from a semi-nomadic background, if you're coming from agropastoralism, and then you're basically told, and I don't mean this sort of implicitly, I mean it very explicitly in school, that your culture and your way of doing things is not valid. And that your way of living isn't valid, even though that is very contradictory to what geographers and climate scientists will tell us about the best way to live in this region, which is through agropastoralism. These are some of the questions that I'm raising, and I am currently writing up, and very happy to take critiques, questions, comments, anything that you have, and I just appreciate you all for coming tonight, so thank you. And as a good teacher, like I used to be, I do have handouts if anyone is interested in taking some of this home, if it in any way is related to your own research and it might be helpful to you. So I'll put those there. Are there any questions or?